She couldn't see the killer, but she knew his voice. "My name is Evelyn Brooks, and tonight I'm opening a file I should have shared years ago. It's about a woman named Margaret Holloway. In 1976, she was the night operator at Cedar Falls's telephone exchange, a small town in rural Pennsylvania where everyone knew everyone, or so they thought. Margaret was blind, had been since birth, but in that cramped little room, filled with switchboards and tangled wires, she could see more than anyone else ever could. This is her story, and I warn you, it doesn't end the way you think. Margaret arrived at the exchange every evening at 6 p.m. sharp. The building sat on the edge of Main Street, a red brick structure with narrow windows that never seemed to let in enough light. Not that it mattered to her. She navigated the 14 steps from the street to her chair by memory, her cane tapping a rhythm only she understood. The exchange itself was a relic. Built in 1922, it still used manual switchboards, rows of jacks and cords that required human hands to connect every single call. In bigger cities, automation had already begun. But Cedar Falls was different. Cedar Falls moved slowly, and the people there liked it that way. The walls inside were lined with cork and fabric to dampen the noise, but Margaret could still hear everything. The hum of electricity through the lines, the faint buzzing when a storm was coming, the way the building settled at night, creaking like an old ship. The other operators, Janet, Louise, and old Mr. Carnaby, worked the day shift. By the time Margaret clocked in, the office was hers alone. Just her, the switchboard, and the voices. And oh, the voices. Margaret had a gift. She could identify anyone in Cedar Falls within 2 words. The mayor's gruff baritone, Mrs. Peterson's nervous stutter, the milkman's lazy drawl. Even the children. She knew them by the pitch of their giggles, the gaps where baby teeth had fallen out. Her fingers moved across the board like a pianist's, plugging chords into jacks, connecting caller to caller. "Number, please?" she'd say, her voice soft and patient. She never got it wrong. People in town used to joke about it. "Margaret knows your voice better than your own mother," they'd say. And it was true. She could hear a cold coming on. She could hear a lie. She could hear when someone was smiling, even over a crackling line. She could hear when Mr. Patterson had been drinking again, even though he swore he was sober. She could hear when young Sarah Miller was calling her boyfriend from her parents' house, whispering so they wouldn't know. She could hear grief, joy, fear. All of it came through those copper wires, and Margaret caught every note. But on November 12th, 1976, something changed. It was 11:47 p.m. when the call came in. Margaret was alone, as always. The exchange was quiet, except for the hum of the equipment and the occasional click of a connection being made. Outside, a cold rain hammered against the windows, the kind of rain that made you grateful to be indoors, the kind that turned dirt roads into rivers and made the whole world feel smaller, darker, more isolated. She'd just connected Mr. Harwell to his sister in Pittsburgh when line 7 lit up. She plugged in. "Number, please." Silence. Not the empty kind. The breathing kind. Someone was there. "Hello?" Margaret said again, a little louder this time. "Cedar Falls Exchange. How may I help you?" Then, barely a whisper. "Help me." It was a woman's voice, young, shaking. Margaret's fingers hovered over the board. Her heart rate quickened, but her voice stayed calm. Years of training had taught her that panic helped no one. "Ma'am, what's your emergency? Do you need the police?" He's coming back." "Who's coming back? Where are you?" But the line went dead. Margaret sat frozen, her hand still gripping the cord. She'd heard fear before, plenty of it. Domestic calls at 2 a.m., drunk husbands, crying wives, teenagers calling from payphones, too scared to go home. But this was different. This was terror. Pure, unfiltered terror. She waited. 1 minute. 2. Her fingers drummed nervously on the edge of the switchboard. Line 7 lit up again. "Number, please?" The same voice, but weaker now, like she was fading. "Please, don't let him find me." "I'm here," Margaret said, forcing calm into her tone. "Tell me where you are. I can send help. I don't know. A house. There's a room. He locked me in. Margaret's mind raced. She tried to picture the voice, tried to place it, but she didn't recognize it. And that was impossible. She knew everyone. In a town of 3,200 people, there were no strangers. Not really. Even the summer tourists, the traveling salesman, the occasional drifter. Margaret heard them all eventually. A wrong number, a collect call, a request for directions. But this girl? This voice? She'd never heard it before. "What's your name?" Margaret asked. A pause, then, "Emily. Emily." Margaret ran through every Emily she knew. Emily Dawson, the librarian. No, too old. Emily Kruger, the teenager. No, wrong voice. Emily Hoffman, the dentist's wife. No, too confident. This Emily was a stranger. But there were no strangers in Cedar Falls. "Emily, listen to me. Can you hear anything? Traffic? A train? Church bells? Rain. Just rain." Margaret closed her eyes. Not that it made a difference. She focused. Rain. A locked room. A man coming back. "Is there a window?" "Boarded up." "A basement?" "I think so." Think. Margaret's heart pounded. The girl was guessing. Disoriented. Maybe drugged. "Emily, I need you to stay on the line. Don't hang up. I'm going to—" Click. The line died again. But the most shocking part was yet to come. Margaret sat there, trembling. Her hands, usually so steady, were shaking. She should call the police. Sheriff Dalton would know what to do. But what would she tell him? A girl named Emily, somewhere in Cedar Falls, in a basement, with a man who locked her in? He'd ask where. She didn't know. He'd ask who. She didn't know. He'd ask if she recognized the voice, and she'd have to say no, which in Cedar Falls meant it wasn't real. Margaret had been doubted before, pitied, patted on the head and told she'd done her best. When she was younger, she'd tried to get a job at the bank, at the post office, at the school, but they all said the same thing. "We just don't think it would be safe." The telephone exchange had been her only option, and even then, it took her mother's pleading and the previous operator's sudden retirement to get her hired. She'd spent 20 years proving herself, 20 years of being twice as good as everyone else, just to be seen as half as capable. She wasn't going to let that happen again. So she did something she'd never done before. She listened. Not to the calls coming in, though she handled those mechanically, her mind elsewhere. No, she listened to the rain, to the faint hum of the wires, to the static between the lines. And that's when she heard it. A pattern. Line 7 rang again at 12:03 a.m., then 12:11, then 12:18, 7 minutes apart. Like clockwork, Margaret realized what was happening. Emily was waiting until she heard footsteps move away, waiting until she thought it was safe to call again, which meant the man was nearby, watching, listening. Margaret waited for the next one, her hand hovering over the jack. When it lit up at 12:25, she plugged in immediately. "Emily? He's here." The girl's voice was barely audible. A whisper so faint, Margaret had to press the receiver hard against her ear. "He's upstairs." "Don't talk," Margaret whispered back. "Just listen. Tap the receiver once for yes, twice for no. Can you do that?" One tap. "Good. You're doing so good, Emily. Is he alone?" One tap. "Is he coming downstairs right now?" Pause. Then 2 taps. Margaret exhaled. "Okay, you're safe for the moment. Is there a phone upstairs too?" One tap. Margaret froze. 2 phones. Same house. That meant, "Emily, when he uses the phone upstairs, can you hear it ring?" One tap. Of course. The killer didn't know the girl had access to a basement line. He thought she was locked away, helpless, cut off from the world. But old houses, especially in Cedar Falls, had extensions everywhere. Basements, attics, even barns. Party lines were still common in 1976. A single phone number could ring in multiple locations. It saved money, but it also meant privacy was a luxury. Margaret's mind spun. If she could just hear him make a call, she'd recognize his voice, and then she'd know. "Stay on the line," Margaret said. "Don't hang up. Even if he comes down. Just set the receiver down quietly. I'll hear everything." One tap. Margaret settled in. Her fingers moved automatically across the switchboard, connecting other calls while keeping line 7 open. Mrs. Kowalski needed the bakery. The bakery needed the supplier. The supplier needed... She did it all on autopilot. Her real attention was on line 7. On Emily. On the man upstairs. Wait, don't miss this detail. For the next 20 minutes, Margaret sat in silence, the receiver pressed to her ear. She could hear Emily breathing. Slow, shallow, scared. She could hear the rain outside, harder now, drumming on a roof. No, on metal. A tin roof, maybe. Or corrugated steel. That narrowed it down. Most houses in Cedar Falls had shingles. Only the older homes, the ones built before the Depression, still had metal roofing. Maybe a dozen properties in total. Margaret made a mental list. The Kowalski farm, the old Miller place on Route 15, the abandoned church on Hickory Street, Mr. Carnaby's house on Ashwood Lane. Then, faintly, footsteps, heavy, boots on wood, the creak of stairs. Emily's breathing stopped. A door opened. Hinges screamed. The kind of scream that comes from rust and neglect. Still awake? A man's voice. Low, calm, almost kind. Margaret's blood turned to ice. She knew that voice. Thought you'd be asleep by now. The man's tone was conversational, like he was talking to a neighbor over a fence. You need to eat. I brought soup. Margaret heard the clink of a bowl being set down. A spoon scraping ceramic. Not hungry? The man sighed. You will be. They always are, eventually. They. Margaret's hand tightened on the cord. Her knuckles went white. You know, the man continued, you're lucky. Most don't last this long, but you're strong. I like that. Emily said nothing. Still not talking? That's fine. I'm a patient man. A pause. I've got all the time in the world. Footsteps again, moving closer to the phone. Margaret held her breath, and then she heard it. The man hummed. Just a few notes, a melody she'd heard 100 times before. Red River Valley. It was the song Mr. Carnaby always hummed while working the day shift. Thomas Carnaby, 62 years old, widower, lived alone on the north side, worked at the exchange since 1946, longer than anyone else, longer than Margaret had been alive. He was the one who trained her, who showed her how to route calls, how to handle emergencies, how to stay calm when someone on the other end was screaming. He'd been kind, patient, fatherly, almost, and now she knew. That's when everything changed. Margaret's hands moved on autopilot. She unplugged from line 7, carefully, silently, and immediately connected to Sheriff Dalton's home number. It rang twice before his groggy voice answered. Dalton. Sheriff, it's Margaret Holloway from the exchange. I need you to listen very carefully, and I need you to believe me. Something in her voice must have cut through the sleep because his tone sharpened. I'm listening. She told him everything. The calls, the voice, the pattern, the song. There was a long pause. Margaret, are you saying you think Tom Carnaby is holding a girl hostage? I'm not saying I think, Sheriff. I'm saying I know. Tom's been working at the exchange for 30 years. He's one of us. I know what he is, Margaret snapped. And I know what I heard. That girl is in his basement right now, and if you don't go, she's going to die. Another pause. Longer this time. She could hear him thinking, weighing, doubting. Sheriff, Margaret said, her voice breaking for the first time. Please, I have never been wrong. Not once in 20 years. Don't let tonight be the first time someone doesn't believe me. Finally. Where does Tom live? Margaret closed her eyes. Think. She'd never been to his house. Of course she hadn't. But she'd heard him talk about it. Heard him complain about the roof leaking, about the furnace breaking down, about how isolated it was. 387 Ashwood Lane, Margaret said. North side, metal roof, 2 stories, basement floods every spring. I'll check it out. Sheriff, he's there now, with her, and he said they always are. That means there were others. I'm going. But Margaret, if you're wrong about this, I'm not wrong. The line clicked off. Even now, Margaret was still holding on. She plugged back into line 7. Emily? No response. Emily, help is coming. Just hold on. Do you hear me? Help is coming. Still nothing. Margaret waited. 5 minutes. 10. She could hear her own heartbeat, could hear the rain, could hear the hum of the lines. Then, shouting. Distant. Muffled. A crash. Footsteps running. A scream, male this time. More shouting. The sound of something heavy hitting the floor. The line went dead. What you've heard so far is only the beginning. Margaret sat at the switchboard for another hour. She couldn't leave. What if Emily called back? What if the sheriff needed her? So she waited. Other calls came in. She answered them mechanically. Number please. Connect. Disconnect. Number please. At 2:17 a.m. her personal line rang. Margaret, it's Dalton. Did you... We found her. Margaret's breath caught. Is she alive? Yeah. Barely. Dehydrated. Bruised. Malnourished. But alive. We're taking her to County General now. Margaret's hands started shaking so hard she had to set the receiver down on the desk. She pressed her palms against her eyes and tried not to cry. Margaret? Dalton's voice sounded far away. You still there? She picked the receiver back up. I'm here. We arrested Tom. He didn't resist, didn't even seem surprised, just asked if you were the one who called, asked how you knew. Margaret said nothing. How did you know? Dalton asked. How did you know it was him? He hummed. Margaret said simply. He what? He hummed. Red River Valley. He always does when he's working. I've heard it 1,000 times, maybe more. There was a long silence on the other end. Margaret, Dalton said quietly. I'm sorry I doubted you. Just make sure he never gets out. He won't. I promise you he won't. Sheriff Dalton found her. Emily Pritchard, 19 years old, from Harrisburg. She'd been hitchhiking to visit her sister in Ohio when Carnaby picked her up on Route 15, told her his car broke down just outside Cedar Falls, offered to let her use his phone to call a tow truck. She'd been in that basement for 6 days. 6 days in the dark. 6 days with minimal food and water. 6 days not knowing if anyone would ever find her. When they brought her out, she was dehydrated, bruised, malnourished, but alive. The press called it a miracle. The mayor gave Margaret a commendation. The governor sent a letter. But here's what they didn't print. When the police searched Carnaby's house, really searched it, tearing up floorboards and breaking through walls, they found something in the attic. A box. Wooden. Locked. Inside were 9 rings. 9 driver's licenses. 9 faces Margaret had never seen. 9 voices she'd never heard. Carnaby confessed to everything. He'd been doing it for years, picking up hitchhikers, runaways, women traveling alone, women no one in Cedar Falls would recognize, women nobody would miss. He had a system. He'd patrol Route 15 during his days off, looking for solo travelers. He'd offer help, bring them to his house, lock them in the basement, and when he was done, he'd bury them in the woods behind his property. He thought he was untouchable. After all, who would suspect the friendly old man who'd worked at the telephone exchange since 1946, who'd buried his wife with full honors, who brought cookies to the church bake sale? But he made one mistake. He hummed. You won't believe what happened next. Margaret Holloway testified at the trial. It was held in the county courthouse, a building she'd only been to once before, for jury duty she wasn't selected for. The defense tried to discredit her. They brought in experts who said you couldn't identify someone by a hummed tune. They argued that her blindness made her an unreliable witness, that she was filling in gaps with her imagination. They painted her as a lonely woman, desperate for attention, a woman who wanted to be a hero. The prosecutor asked Margaret a simple question. In your 20 years as a telephone operator, how many voices have you identified? Margaret thought for a moment. Thousands. And how many times have you been wrong? Never. The defense objected. The judge allowed it. The prosecutor pressed on. Miss Holloway, when you heard Mr. Carnaby hum Red River Valley over the phone line, were you certain it was him? Yes. No doubt at all? None. Why? Margaret turned her head toward where she knew the jury sat. Because I've spent my entire life learning to listen. Most people use their eyes. I use my ears. And Mr. Carnaby has a very distinctive way of humming. He always goes slightly flat on the third note. Always. I've heard him do it hundreds of times. The courtroom was silent. I didn't want it to be him. Margaret continued. He trained me. He was kind to me when others weren't. But I know what I heard. And that girl is alive, because I trusted what I know. But the jury didn't need convincing. They'd seen the evidence. The rings. The licenses. The faces. And they'd heard Emily Pritchard's testimony. How she'd found the phone in the dark. How she'd called for help. How a voice on the other end, calm, steady, certain, had told her to hold on. Carnaby was convicted on 9 counts of kidnapping and murder. He died in prison 3 years later. Heart attack. Quick and painless, they said. Too painless, if you ask me. As for Margaret, she kept working the night shift, said she liked the quiet, liked knowing that if someone needed help, she'd hear them. Emily Pritchard visited her once, a year after the trial. They sat in the exchange together, drinking tea while Margaret answered calls. How did you know? Emily asked. How did you know it was him? Margaret smiled. I've spent my whole life listening. Most people hear words. I hear everything else, the pauses, the breaths, the things people don't say. Emily reached across the table and took Margaret's hand. You saved my life. You saved your own life, Margaret said. You were brave enough to call. I just answered. But they both knew that wasn't entirely true. But wait, there's one more thing. After Carnaby's arrest, the day shift operators went through his desk. They found a notebook tucked behind a stack of outdated phone directories. Inside were names, dates, locations, routes, and on the last page, written in his meticulous handwriting, Margaret suspects, too smart, watches too closely, notices patterns, must be careful, must wait, opportunity will come. He'd known, for months, maybe longer, he'd known she was paying attention, listening, watching in her own way, and he'd been planning. The night Emily called, that was supposed to be Margaret's last shift. Carnaby had requested to work late, said he wanted to train the new hire who was starting next week, but the new hire called in sick at the last minute, so Margaret worked alone. And Emily lived. But if things had gone differently, if the new hire had shown up, if Margaret had taken the night off, if Carnaby had been there instead, well, there might have been 10 rings in that box, and Margaret's name might have been in that notebook. I still think about Margaret sometimes, about how close it came, about the voices she saved and the ones she never got to hear. She passed away in 1994, at the age of 63, heart attack in her sleep. Quick and painless, they said. Her funeral was standing room only. People came from 3 counties over. Former callers, former colleagues, people whose lives she'd touched in ways they didn't even realize until she was gone. Emily Pritchard was there. She brought flowers, lilies, Margaret's favorite, though I don't know how she knew that. But here's what stayed with me. At the service, Sheriff Dalton, retired by then, white-haired and slow-moving, stood up to speak. He told the story of that November night, how Margaret had called him, how she'd insisted, how she'd been right, and then he said something I'll never forget. She saw more in the dark than most of us ever see in the light. The exchange closed in 1998. Automation finally came to Cedar Falls. The building was torn down to make room for a parking lot. But on the corner of Main Street, there's a small plaque. Most people walk past it without noticing. It reads, "In memory of Margaret Holloway, 1931-1994. She listened when no one else could hear." And beneath that, in smaller letters, some voices are meant to be heard, and some are meant to listen. I visited Cedar Falls once, years after Margaret died. I stood in that parking lot where the exchange used to be, closed my eyes, listened, and I swear, just for a moment, I could hear it. The hum of the switchboard, the click of connections being made, the soft, patient voice saying, "Number, please?" Margaret Holloway spent her life in the dark, connecting people to each other, bridging distances, making sure no one was ever truly alone. And on one cold November night in 1976, she did more than connect a call. She saved a life. Not because she could see, but because she knew how to listen. Because she trusted herself when no one else did. Because she understood that sometimes the most important things in life aren't seen, they're heard. This has been Echoes of 1970. I'm Evelyn Brooks. Some voices are meant to be heard, and some are meant to listen. Thank you for listening tonight. Good night.